Good evening and welcome to tonight's Cary Science Conversation. My name is Lori Quillen and I'm the Director of Communications at Cary Institute of Ecosystem Studies. I want to give guests a few minutes to arrive before turning the program over to Cary President Dr. Joshua Ginsberg. It's great to see so many engaged with science and interested in learning more about how climate change is impacting Northeastern forests. We have a few poll questions that will help us better understand who's in the crowd tonight. Is this your first time attending a Cary program? Are you familiar with Hubbard Brook? Have you been impacted by an ice storm? Take a minute and let us know. Once you're done with the polls, we'd love to know where you're zooming in from and what brought you to tonight's program. You can share in the chat, and you can find that if you scroll to the bottom of your Zoom window, there's a conversation bubble and you click on that and you can enter into the chat and let us know. How'd you find us? Why are you here tonight? During the program, if you have questions for Lindsey and Peter, please ask them in the Q&A. We'll be turning the chat feature off when the conversation begins. You can find the Q&A also at the bottom of your screen. It's the one with the two conversation bubbles. And questions you put there will be revisited. So as the program goes on, just enter them in real time. And I'm gonna give the poll a few more minutes and just let you know about some upcoming programs while folks are entering in their info. Our academic lectures at Cary Institute have gone virtual and they're open to the public. If you're looking to take a deeper dive into ecological science, join us on Thursdays at 11 a.m. Tomorrow, Dr. Naima Harris, Director of the Applied Wildlife Ecology Lab at the University of Michigan, will be discussing risk and reward, how carnivores survive in dynamic urban environments. Our next Cary Science Conversation will be on January 28th, and we'll continue on the theme of forests. This time, we're going to be going to the tropics with Cary scientist Sarah Batterman. She'll discuss her work on tropical forest recovery and carbon storage. And another one to add to your calendar, on February 25th, we'll be having a science conversation with bestselling author Simon Winchester. He and Josh will be discussing his new book, Land, How the Hunger for Ownership Shaped the Modern World. So keep an eye on our events page, follow us on social, learn more about those events as they get posted. And I'm going to share the poll, although folks are still coming in and entering info. Let's see, we'll share this now. And this is really exciting. So we have a lot of new faces in the crowd tonight, and about half of you have heard about Hubbard Brook, and well over half of you have been impacted by an ice storm. And with that, I'm going to turn the event over to Cary's president, Dr. Joshua Ginsberg, and he will begin the program.
Good evening. I had to remember to both unmute and turn on my camera. Thank you all for joining us. I'm really glad to see that over half of our attendees are new to Cary and new to these events. We are based in Millbrook, New York, which is about 100 miles almost exactly north of New York City, just off the Taconic Parkway for those of you who are Northeasterners. We're an independent research institute, and we focus on doing ecological studies at large ecosystem scales. Our areas of expertise are broad, but we do a lot of work on freshwater ecosystems, disease ecology, and particularly now we're focusing as never before on pandemic spillover. We also do work in urban ecology and, of course, forest ecology, which will be sort of the leitmotif of tonight's talk. We are glad to have you here. We are sad that our usual Friday night at the Cary seminar series has been suspended for COVID, as has our series in New York called Cary in the City. But one of the great things about this Cary Science Conversation is that we've drawn in people from all over the country and in fact all over the world. And on a usual night at a, oops, sorry, I need to turn off my phone. Sorry about that. On a usual night, at one of our in real life seminars, we might have 100, 120 people. Right now, we're up to almost 400 attendees, and that's fantastic. So thank you for coming. And let me introduce the panelists tonight. I'll start with Peter Groffman. Dr. Peter Groffman is a professor at the CUNY Advanced Science Research Center in Manhattan and a research fellow at Cary Institute of Ecosystem Studies, where Peter spent 20 years as a senior scientist. And he keeps his lab there, and we like having him around. So he's got I consider it a joint appointment. He's a microbial ecologist whose work sort of spans from urban to rural. He's very involved with the Baltimore Ecosystem Study, our long-term research in Baltimore, and is about to become the lead investigator on the Hubbard Brook Long-Term Ecological Research Program, which is a National Science Foundation funded multi-year study. This has been going on, Hubbard Brook has been going on for over 50 years. And Gary Lovett will be retiring at the end of December and handing the reins over to Peter. Peter is a remarkable ecologist and has studied everything from why lawns look the way they do to the ecology of invasive earthworms and what they do to soils. So it's a pleasure to have Peter here tonight. Our second panelist is Dr. Lindsey Rustad. Lindsey co-directs the USDA, that's U.S. Department of Agriculture, Northeast Climate Hub, and she's a research ecologist for the USDA's Forest Service Center for Research on Ecosystem Change. And I think relevant to tonight's study, a team leader for the Hubbard Brook Experimental Forest. Lindsey did her BA in philosophy, which I think is wonderful. She has a real philosophical bent. At Cornell, a master's in forest science in the institution formerly known as the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies, now the Yale School of the Environment, and a PhD from the University of Maine. So it's wonderful to have Peter and Lindsey joining us. And let me just say a little bit about the Hubbard Brook Ecosystem Study. The Hubbard Brook is a wonderful place to work. It's part of the Forest Service research network in the United States. And it is based in central New Hampshire and has some very rare qualities to it. It has a number, 8, I believe, separate drainages. And that allows you to study the way that nutrients and acid rain and other things move through the ecosystem. In fact, acid rain was, in quotes, discovered, end quote, by Herb Borman and Gene Likens, parenthesis, Gene Likens, founder of Cary Institute, end parenthesis, at Hubbard Brook, starting in the late 1960s, ending in a paper, or initially in being published as the term acid rain in a paper in Science in the early 1970s. So Hubbard Brook has had a long affiliation with Cary Institute. It's a wonderful place. Hundreds of people work there when we don't have a COVID pandemic. And it's a great honor to have both Lindsey and Peter here with us. So let me see if I can close the poll on my screen. There we go. Let me change my view to gallery view and see. Yes, we do have the Hubbard Brook Experimental Forest slide up there. Let me start by saying both of you have been working in the White Mountains of New Hampshire for quite a while. And I was wondering if you could set the stage by telling us a little bit about the Hubbard Brook field site.
Okay, so I'll be glad to tackle that. And so both Peter and I, as you heard, work at the Hubbard Brook Experimental Forest, and there's going to be a little bit of repetition here. You're going to hear a lot about Hubbard Brook tonight. And I can see from the poll that 50% of you or even more are already familiar with Hubbard Brook. For those of you who aren't, Hubbard Brook is a world-renowned center for research on water and forests. I like to think about it right here in New England. We are, as Josh said, located in the White Mountains of New Hampshire. Hubbard Brook is about an 8,000-acre valley. It's covered with beautiful century-old hardwood trees at the lower elevations and spruce and fir at higher elevations. You can see some of those on this image here, covered by some new snow. The Hubbard Brook is drained by that series of small streams that run into the Hubbard Brook itself, and those run into the Pemigewasset River that runs into the Merrimack, which runs into the Atlantic Ocean, which means that many of you may have already recreated in waters that originated from the Hubbard Brook Experimental Forest. So a little bit more history about Hubbard Brook. The Hubbard Brook Experimental Forest was established 65 years ago in 1955 by the USDA Forest Service as a center for research on water. for New England. And since that time, it has expanded to include research on the entire forest ecosystem and is now one of the longest continuously running, and of course I'm a little bit biased, but perhaps one of the most famous ecosystem study sites in the world. So at Hubbard Brook, our research focuses on long-term studies as well as large, and I might say daring, experiments, and we're going to hear about two of these tonight. And I just want to make the point that these long-term studies are super important really for three reasons. One, they are our principal record of change over time. So we all know that forests and their ecosystems change slowly over periods of decades to centuries, maybe to millennia. Our long-term studies make these slow, hard to see changes seen, if you will. They also provide the context for identifying extreme or unexpected events. So we have to know what's normal if we want to know what's abnormal. And finally, they can be the canary in the coal mine. So they can give us early warnings on potential environmental threats, as well as potential environmental opportunities. So the experiments that we do there, on the other hand, are kind of the bread and butter of us scientists. They allow us to use a scientific method to test hypotheses about cause and effect relationships. They allow us to simulate future conditions, like, say, warmer worlds with less snow. And they allow us to test and validate these sophisticated quantitative models, which are useful to foresters and land managers. So as Josh alluded to, at Hubbard Brook, we have combined these two things, long-term studies and experiments. And some of our research highlights include response of these headwater streams to forest harvest. We mentioned the discovery of acid rain. We have some of the longest running resident and migratory bird studies in the world. And because we've been going for 65 plus years, we have the opportunity to study the impact of climate change and extreme weather events on our northern forest ecosystems. So just a little bit, or maybe a lot about Hubbard Brook. If you haven't been there, you don't know it.
Thanks, Lindsay. You know, every year for the last 6 years, I've gone to what's called the Hubbard Brook Cooperators Meeting, which is all the people that are doing research at Hubbard Brook at any given time. And it's about 180 people, 150 to 200 people every year. So that gives you a sense of this research endeavor. Lindsay, you mentioned long-term ecological research. There is actually a program that I mentioned earlier called the Long-Term Ecological Research, or LTER program of the National Science Foundation. Peter has chaired the committee which oversees this group of 20 plus sites. And I think it'd be great if, Peter, maybe you could give an example of LTER work and why, sort of amplify what Lindsay said on why LTER research is so important.
So sure. So the Long-Term Ecological Research Network is funded by the National Science Foundation. There's 28 of these long-term ecological research sites, mostly in the continental US, but there's a couple in Alaska, there's a couple in Antarctica, there's a couple offshore in the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. And the LTER network originated based on the realization back in the 60s that ecosystems were complex. And as Lindsay said, they're complex systems and they change slowly and in complex ways in response to environmental change. And so ecologists realized early on that we were going to need long-term observations and long-term experiments, which you're going to hear some about today, in order to understand ecosystems. And the ability to have long-term study sites has been critical to our success in environmental science in general and in ecosystem ecology in particular. And I'm going to make the case, as much as I can, that environmental science has actually been quite successful as a discipline in our ability to identify problems, propose solutions to those problems, have society implement those solutions, and then track the response to those solutions. And the best example is probably acid rain, which was identified originally in Europe, but then in North America. Gene Ligens, the founding director of the Cary Institute, observed that the precipitation at Hubbard Brook was acidic and that it was causing real problems for the forests and associated aquatic ecosystems. And they did a bunch of long-term research and they said, well, we have a solution. We need these Clean Air Act amendments and they were implemented. And then because we've been tracking the progress of the over the last 50 years or so, we have been able to see the effectiveness of the Clean Air Act amendments. And it's just a classic example where our ability to identify a problem, propose a solution, and then track the implementation and success of that solution. And long-term research is essential to that. And so the LTER network is doing that across the country with, we have coastal systems, we have many forest sites, we have an agricultural site, we have a couple of urban sites, the Arctic changing at an incredible rate. And so many of the hardest problems, we like to think that in the long-term ecological research network, it's a great gift and opportunity to have long-term funding. We'd like to think that we're using that to tackle the hardest problems in science and society.
That's great, Peter. And you know, I think that tonight's discussion will show that there are, Lindsey referenced 2 case studies on winter weather and changes in winter weather, both of which were done at Hubbard Brook. You know, it's hard to see on a day-to-day basis, particularly today, where those of you in New England know it's rather chilly. But it's hard to see how warming weather is affecting our lives. And I was wondering, you know, particularly, what does warming weather mean for the northern forest? Peter, maybe you could start. Lindsey, chime in if you'd like.
Yeah, so climate change is, of course, the overarching challenge in environmental science and ecology now. And we're going to talk about winter climate change tonight. And when people think of climate change, they usually think of really hot summer days, and maybe we're going to have more droughts, or maybe we're going to have more storms. But some of the really most surprising and challenging aspects of climate change occur in the winter. And as you can see on the slide here, warming has actually been much more marked in the winter than it has been in the summer. So our summers are a little bit warmer, but our winters are actually quite a bit warmer than they used to be. And the most dramatic change that we've had in our climate in the Northeast has actually been the loss of very cold days, very cold nights. So you think in any given winter, a big statistic to keep track of is what was the coldest day of the winter. And so around here in Millbrook, you know, it used to get to -20 or -25 every 5 to 10 years or so. It hasn't been -25 in Millbrook since 1994. Now, is that good or is that bad? Well, if you own a furnace, it's pretty good, right? Because your furnace breaks when it's on those really cold nights. And really cold nights are dangerous. They're dangerous to human health and exposure. But ecologically, the loss of cold temperatures has a big effect on the distribution of organisms, plants and insects in particular. So for instance, I would like to grow bananas in Millbrook, but I can't grow bananas in Millbrook because they'll get killed in the winter when it's cold. Insects are also, the distribution of insects very much controlled by the very cold temperatures. So we have in this part of New York moving in the Asian tiger mosquito. We have the hemlock woolly adelgid, which is devastating hemlock trees all throughout the Northeast. The hemlock woolly adelgid and the Asian tiger mosquito were never supposed to get here because it's too cold at night. But yet they're established and they're breeding, and it's causing devastation to forests. So that's an example of a surprising aspect of climate change, the loss of extreme cold temperatures. The other thing that's really interesting to us is snow, and we're going to talk about that. So interestingly, the amount of snow in any given year hasn't changed much over time. And in particular, we get about the same amount of snow we get in these really big events. I don't know if you keep track of this, but you know, they've been keeping track of snowfall in New York City since 1865. And since that time, you know, in that giant record, 4 of the 10 largest snowstorms have occurred in the last 10 years. So since 2010. So we get lots of big snowstorms, and the total snowfall is about the same, but it's warmer. And so maximum snow depth is less, and the days of snow cover are less. And we started making observations at places like Hubbard Brook that there were these days where there was just no snow and the soil would freeze. And again, that's another kind of surprising, complex, and important aspect of climate change that we've been studying at Hubbard Brook.
Yeah, and Peter, so folks know, we've ordered the slides in such a way that everybody gets a chance to talk. And if you think I'm just picking on Peter right now, I'll pick on Lindsey in a little bit. But, you know, Peter, you are extraordinarily fond of snow. And if anybody ever wants either someone to shovel their driveway for them, or even better yet, to coordinate a team of people to shovel your driveway, Peter is the guy to ask. And so, Peter, might you talk to us about, your fondness for shoveling snow?
Yeah, so we wanted to, and this gives an opportunity to share a little bit about how we ask scientific questions. And so we were very interested in understanding what is the effect of loss of snow in the northern forest, and we started to study it with plot studies. And you can see the slide over here is I really like to show this slide because we wanted to say, well, okay, what happens if the forest has less snow? And we could wait for an event when, a winter when there's no snow, or we could use natural variation in snow depth, or we could do a manipulation study. And this is what we did. So we have plots in the woods. And one of our original snow shovelers is actually joining here. I was just delighted to see him in the chat list. But so we have been for many years now a series of experiments where we actually shovel snow out of the woods, and that gives us the opportunity to evaluate the effects of that in the forest. And I'll talk about that a little bit, and I'll show you another slide. But I worry about this picture, and all scientists worry about that. We try and draw inference about complex phenomenon from limited experimental data. So when I look at this plot, I ask people, is this a good way to study snow in the forest? And people say, well, gee, the plot's kind of small, and didn't you trample it when you shoveled it? And what about the edge effect? And I like to make the point that all scientists are trying to draw conclusions or learn about things from a limited amount of information. And one of my favorite examples is, so let's say instead of studying snow in the woods, Lindsey and I were making a new artificial sweetener. So let's say we had invented a new artificial sweetener, or let's say a vaccine, for example, and we wanted to know if the artificial sweetener was safe. Now, if we really wanted to tell if that artificial sweetener was safe, we'd get 5,000 people, we'd give them a small dose of the artificial sweetener, and we'd track them for 30 years. And then we'd get 5,000 other people, we'd use them as a control group, and we would follow them for 30 years, and then we would know after 30 years if the artificial sweetener was safe. Now, is that how we test artificial sweeteners? No, we don't. What we do is we get a giant chunk of artificial sweetener and we feed it to a rat, and we see if the rat dies, and then we know if it's the artificial sweetener safe or not. This plot and Lindsey's ice plots, which you'll see later, are our rats. And in all disciplines of science, we need some type of experimental platform or experimental manipulation to draw inference. And it's hard, and we worry about it a lot. So we've done experiments with plots, and we've done experiments with where we looked at natural gradients up and down the slope. We waited for years with no snow, and we used multiple lines of evidence. But these plots were very useful because we could replicate them, we could locate them in different parts of the forest, we could instrument them very intensively, and we could learn lots about them. Now, I think we might have a slide that illustrates what we're excited about with snow. And maybe if Leslie could switch to the next slide. But here it is, right? So the big thing with snow is snow acts as an insulator of the forest floor. And in the absence of snow, the forest floor becomes vulnerable to freezing. And this is really interesting. And one of the things we say is that somewhat surprisingly, we actually have colder soils in a warmer world, right? The temperature's higher, it's warmer, but since we lose the snow and the insulating blanket of the snow, the soil becomes frozen. If you go up into the woods in Vermont, New Hampshire, in the middle of the winter, the soil's not frozen. There'll be the soil's at about 1 degree C, and the roots are alive, and the insects are alive, and there's a bunch of small mammals running around, and there's a whole subniveal ecosystem, they call it. And if you lose the snow cover, then it's a huge disruption to that system. It freezes the system and damages roots and damages nutrient cycling processes and damages the productivity of the forest, and it's a big stress. And so that's what we've been studying. We've been studying this at Hubbard Brook since the 90s.
So that's great, Peter. So, because we all live in a zone that is tick central in Millbrook and much of the Northeast and Middle Atlantic, would this mean that since the soils are getting colder, we'll have fewer ticks?
Boy, we can always hope. Certainly a lot of the research at Cary on ticks has focused on soil conditions as it affects ticks. When do the ticks dry out? But we haven't had a lot of studies on the effects of snow and ticks. But we have observed many effects in our, and we haven't explicitly studied that in our manipulation plots. But in general, what we've seen when we manipulate the snow is the soil freezes. Even if it's not a cold winter, the soil freezes. We've seen really significant damage to the roots of sugar maple trees in particular. Sugar maple is a species we're really interested in the northern forests. And so there's particular damage to sugar maple roots. We've seen long-term declines in sugar maple growth in plots that we've manipulated for multiple years. We've had damage to the nutrient cycle. So the forest loses valuable nutrients. They go washing out of the forest. Those nutrients become pollutants when they get in streams and lakes. And so it affects multiple ecosystem services in the forest, whether it is productivity or water quality, or we've seen greenhouse gas emissions have gone up as well. So both, it's a problem when we lose the stuff.
Okay, and so Peter mentioned that despite that it's getting warmer, there's more snow. There's also more ice. And for those of us who love the way trees look after an ice storm and hate the way our power goes out, Lindsey has been studying this in a similarly quantitative and structured way. And I hope she'll have time to show a little video because it's a remarkable story. So, despite being beautiful and destructive, what inspired you, Lindsey, to do what I think is the first big experimental manipulation that looked at the impacts of ice storms on forests?
Okay. Well, as a New Englander, I am no stranger to ice storms. And in fact, I was in Maine during what we call the ice storm of 1998, where myself and my family were without power for 3 weeks in the middle of a bitter, cold January. However, the actual event that inspired me to study ice storms for a living occurred about a decade later in 2009. And I was driving back from a meeting in New York City to my office in Durham, New Hampshire, when I had to unexpectedly drive through the teeth of an ice storm to get there. And as I was driving on the Mass Turnpike, some of you might know the Mass Pike, cars were sliding off the road in every which way, and my car was fishtailing back and forth across the highway, and trees were littered like broken matchsticks along the side of the road. And I have to say, the experience was absolutely terrifying. So when I got back to my office in Durham, I walked into my colleague John Campbell's office and I said, "Oh my God, what was that?" And he had been watching from his windows, and we agreed on the spot that we needed to learn more about these super destructive winter weather events. So we learned 3 things right off the bat. One, we learned that ice storms are already a big deal. They are, in fact, relatively common winter weather events that occur in northern forests around the world. 2, we learned that ice storms are already a major cause of disruption in towns and cities and forests. You may not know, but ice storms are responsible for almost 60% of winter storm losses. When they come, right, everything closes down. They disrupt infrastructure like schools and businesses and hospitals. And unfortunately, they cause injury and even death from accidents, as well as carbon monoxide poisoning from unventilated wood stoves or generators when the power is out. The third thing we learned was that there's growing evidence that ice storms may be becoming more frequent and more severe under our warming climate. Despite these 3 things, we also realized that we didn't really know that much about them. And that's because ice storms are super hard to study. We can't predict when they're going to occur in time or space. And even when they do hit, we scientists need to be taking cover and stay home. So that's the experience that I had that got me inspired to study ice storms.
Great. Now, so you had this motivation. Where did you end up taking it? Because as you said, it's not like, ice storms are essentially a natural experiment, but unlike many natural experiments with scientists avail themselves of, even hurricanes and people who do crazy things like run after tornadoes, it's just not safe. Forget studying the ice storm. It's just not safe to go out and get to where you want to study the ice storm. So how did you solve the problem?
Well, funny that you mentioned tornadoes. John and I actually toyed with the idea of being ice storm chasers and to have a to-go bag and get ready for the next big ice storm to hit in New England. But we quickly realized that that was not very safe or wasn't very practical. So instead, we decided to create an experimental ice storm in our own outdoor laboratory at the Hubbard Brook Experimental Forest. So we started in the winter of 2010, just a few weeks after my super scary experience on the Mass Pike, learning how to use firefighting equipment to create glaze ice on trees on the banks of the Hubbard Brook, using the Hubbard Brook as our water source. So during the next winter in 2011, we conducted a pilot ice storm experiment. And then based on the results of the pilot ice storm experiment, we were able to fund the full ice storm experiment in 2015 through the National Science Foundation. So in the full ice storm experiment, we recreated a suite of simulated ice storms on 10 plots. Each plot was the size of a basketball court, and they were located about halfway up the Hubbard Brook Valley. So our suite of storms included no ice, light icing, moderate icing, extreme icing, and moderate icing in 2 consecutive back-to-back years. The light icing was a 1/4 inch, and it corresponded to the National Weather Service's ice storm warning in southern New England. Moderate ice storm was 1/2 inch, and it corresponded to the ice storm warnings in northern New England. The extreme icing was 3/4 of an inch of ice, and that corresponded to what would be an epic ice storm, even bigger than the ice storm of 1998. So people ask, how do you make an ice storm? Rather than telling you, I have a little video that I hope we can pull up and show you how we do that.
Great.
Torch, if you could bring it down the stream, that'd be great. If we have anybody with eyes on gasoline stand. Wow. We're at the bottom of the clock. Also have to remember to record the climb when you start to race. 25 is the time we started. Is there anyone near the trailer who could bring a pole saw from up there down to the Kubota? Sure, let me just find one, I'll bring it down.
So there you go. That's how you make an ice storm.
Here we go, unmuted. You know, so that's incredible. I mean, that was a tiny little clip. How many hours did one of those experiments take to execute?
Well, we could do one of those basketball-sized courts in 4 hours. So we could do 2 at night. And you see these at night because we had to do this in the coldest part of the day so that we could have the best chance of making ice. So we were out there in the middle of the night icing, and we could do 2 of these. So you can imagine we had 8 to do. So that was 4 nights in one year and 2 nights in the next year.
Wow.
So it was a big undertaking.
It's big. You know, that little tiny clip was speeded up, but it was a big undertaking. And what did you discover?
Well, I like to think that we learned a lot of practical information on the immediate impacts of ice storms in our northern forests. And when I say immediate, I'm talking from an ecologist perspective. So in the first 2, 3, 4 years after we did these treatments. So for example, for emergency managers and town planners, we can now provide an actual estimate of the amount of woody material that comes down in different intensity and frequencies of ice storms so that managers can better plan for post-ice storm cleanups. One surprise was that more woody material fell in the second year than the first year when we did those back-to-back ice storms. We had thought we would have thinned the canopy and there would have been less that came down, but we actually got more in that second year. And this too was of great interest to managers relative to cleanup, as well as to the electric power utility companies. Meanwhile, for arborists, we were able to show how branches break under different ice loads. They don't just cleanly break, they rather rip and shred, and they create these large gaping wounds and expose a lot of the underlying wood. For ecologists and foresters, we can now provide direct estimates of canopy gaps and changes to forest structure, the amount of light coming down through the forest, and all of this we're going to be able to use to model how these storms might impact the future health and productivity of these systems. I think one of the most interesting observations for having been through all of these is that there appear to be certain tipping points or thresholds of response. So for example, when we first started adding ice to the trees, it was one of the most exquisite experiences as that ice glistened in the moonlight and the frozen twigs kind of gently brushed against each other with like a tinkling sound up in the trees. You may have heard it out in an ice storm. But as we added more ice, we got to a first tipping point where all of a sudden the twigs began to break. And then we added more ice and we got to a second tipping point where all of a sudden branches were breaking and beginning to boom as they fell. And then we added more ice and we got to a third tipping point where whole tree tops started snapping under the weight of the accumulating ice. So in our experiments, the conditions went from sublime to terrifying in a series of tipping points over a period of those 4 hours, which is what you'd ask me how long it took. And just kind of thinking about where we're going next, this is really just the beginning. Our plan is, like many of the things we do at Hubbard Brook, is to continue to follow the fate of these ice stands really for years to come. We want to know, do they recover? How fast do they recover? Where they're going to be susceptible to secondary stressors like insects or pests or pathogens. And I'm sure we're going to find all kinds of unanticipated surprises, which we usually do when we're doing this kind of research.
Yeah, and you know, I noticed that everybody's wearing hard hats, which of course would help when the branches or maybe the twigs start breaking. But when those whole trunks start falling on you, I suspect terrifying was exactly the right word.
Although I do want to remind everybody, we were outside the plots. So it was quite amazing that we could be outside, we could be safe, but looking in at this amazing event.
Good. And, you know, ice storms are but one type of extreme weather event. And, you know, I'm sort of curious because for those of you who don't know, they monitor everything at Hubbard Brook. It is one, Peter used the verb to instrument earlier, which is a way of scientists saying we got a lot of things out there measuring a lot of things. And I'm wondering whether some of the other extreme events, the windstorms, the huge rainfall, you know, the massive rainfalls we've had in some of the hurricanes and near hurricanes that hit the Northeast, how is that sort of amplifying or affecting the results you've seen on the ice storm stands?
Well, we do see all kinds of different winter and non-winter weather events. But one thing that I think is kind of interesting, and one thing that we're learning, is that as the underlying conditions out there are changing, such as the climate or air pollution, the forest response to these different kinds of extreme events are also changing, so that we can't always predict what will happen in the future based on what has happened in the past. And so I want to put up this image and give you an example here. So if you're from New England, right, like many of us are, then you know we often have a January thaw and we have a winter rain event. So if we go back to 1960, I guess we have the snow there. So if we go back to 1960, we used to have these beautiful deep snowpacks, and these snowpacks acted like sponges, soaking up that water in those winter rain events, and then either slowly releasing it back into the streams or even holding it until snowmelt the next year. If you fast forward to that middle image there, say 2020, we now have shallower, right, more intermittent snowpacks, just like Peter was just telling us about. And that same winter rain may hit ice or frozen ground, causing it to rush down to the streams, creating flooding and even scouring out our stream channels. So if you fast forward into the future, another 60 years to say 2080, the image on the right, that same winter rain might hit thawed ground and just gently percolate through the soil. So the same event, but 3 different outcomes. So I say this because we're seeing seeing evidence of a similar phenomena at Hubbard Brook with a nutrient called nitrogen, right? So back in the 1980s and 90s, when the forest was disturbed either through extreme winter weather events like the 1998 ice storm or soil freezing, like Peter was talking about, nitrogen came pouring out of the forest and into the streams. And that was a bad thing because one, the forest was losing nitrogen, which is an important plant nutrient, but 2, that nitrogen was going downstream where it caused havoc, like eutrophication, that is algal blooms, or degraded our drinking water quality. So now here we are in the 2010s, almost the 2020s. And so when we disturb the forest in the same way, either through our experimental icing or our freeze experiments, no nitrogen comes out. So what happened? We don't know, but we know that something has changed. And like good ecological detectives, we now have new studies trying to find out what has changed. So we're not seeing this response that we saw in the past, we're not seeing now. So it's this whole kind of shifting underlying templates that we have to understand.
Right.
If that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes good sense. And for those of you who don't know Peter, the reason that Lindsey mentioned nitrogen is Peter's great love in life is nitrogen. And if you let Peter talk about nitrogen, we would run past the 8 o'clock cutoff. There'd be no times for questions. We would all learn a lot. But he's taught me that nitrogen is a wondrous thing. So I'm going to shift subjects on you, Peter. I'm sorry. And we're going to.
I have some scientific papers if people are having trouble sleeping at night. I can provide those.
There's some of them are posted on the Cary Institute website under Peter Groffman's page, so do go there. But Peter, one of the interesting things about ice and snow is not only are we all aware of it, but it's really critically important for a number of industries and the livelihoods of many, many people in New England. So I was wondering if you could, talk about recreation, tourism, snowshoeing. Somebody in the chat said, I'm hoping to find out when I can put my snowshoes on. We had snow today, but not enough for snowshoes. How is all this and what have our findings done to help inform those industries in New England?
So one of the great changes in science, modern environmental science, I would argue over the last 20 or 30 years, is we have greatly improved the way that we interact with stakeholders. So instead of just informing people, rather we have these dialogues with people to find out, okay, what are your perceptions? And then what are you concerned about? What do you observe? And then we get to share our observations. And there's much more of a dialogue and an interaction with stakeholders than there used to be. And we've had really, and the winter climate stuff has been a really great platform for engaging with stakeholders. Because people have observations and they have interests and they have concerns about changes in the winter climate. Now, Hubbard Brook is managed by the USA Forest Service, and so everything we do, we spend a lot of time talking with the forestry community. And the simple thing I learned early on is if you're cutting trees in the woods, it's a whole lot easier to slide them out over the snow than it is to drag them out over the mud or over the bare ground. And so a loss of snow is of great concern to the forestry community. It's of great concern to the road community. Does it make mud season worse? As the winter climate has changed, it seems that almost everything makes mud season worse, especially if you have a bad mud season. But there's lots of infrastructure are concerns. But one of the ones that's really interesting and surprising to me has been skiing and winter recreation. So there's an obvious concern that as we have less snow, it's going to have a negative effect on winter recreation, in particular downhill skiing and cross-country skiing and snowmobiling. But one of the things that we really was interested to discover when we started engaging with people is this incredible wellspring of creativity and adaptation to winter climate change. So as a kid growing up in New Jersey, it was a big thrill for us to go ski at Mount Snow in Vermont, right? And this was a long time ago. And so it snows a lot less. There's a lot less natural snow cover in Vermont and New Hampshire than there was when I was a kid, but Mount Snow is open a lot more days for skiing than it was when I was a kid, because they have adapted to climate change with snowmaking. And they've got it increasingly efficient and increasingly effective at making snow. They use some of our data from Hubbard Brook. And so it was really quite interesting to see, and even the cross-country ski people and the snowmobilers have learned how to cross-country ski or snowmobile on less snow. So they maintain their trails. They pull rocks off the trails. They build bridges over the streams. And so now you can cross-country ski or snowmobile on just a foot of snow rather than the 2 or 3 feet of snow that you needed, that you needed before. So by engaging with stakeholders, we got a sense of what people were observing, what they were concerned about, and we were just impressed with the things that they're doing. But the other thing that we learned is that the interactions between science and society are complex. So we were talking once with his family had run a downhill skiing, a small family operated downhill skiing operation for several generations. And he said to us, he said, every time there's an article in the Boston Globe with one of you scientists talking about how winter climate change is going to be the end of the ski industry, he says, you're killing me. He said, so when people see an article like that, they say, well, maybe I won't buy a season's pass, or maybe I won't buy new skis and boots. And he said, we appreciate the concern, but sometimes the scientific news that you're putting out there is at cross purposes to what we're trying to accomplish. And so we've learned a lot about communicating our science, and most importantly, the value of engaging with stakeholders to find out, well, what do they perceive and what do they value and what are they concerned about, and can we use that to make our science more effective? But it is a really a big deal, affecting lots of the industries in the Northeast, the changes in the winter, whether it's timbering, road maintenance, downhill skiing, cross-country skiing. There's also concern, as we mentioned before, a lot of the changes in winter climate are particularly tough on sugar maple, which is a charismatic species in the area. And so people are concerned about loss of sugar maple for winter fall foliage and maple sugar making. So I think it's an important topic, and I think we're making progress at engaging with people on that.
Yeah, and let me just note that in the chat, there's a reference to a new report. We're going to talk about it in a little bit from our friends at the Hubbard Brook Research Foundation, confronting our changing winters. So we'll put that up as well, and we'll include it in the follow-up email. So don't worry if you don't catch that. I think, Peter, that was a good summary. It's a huge issue. Of course, it makes one think about buying a little cabin up in the Laurentians and moving north of the border. But really, I think the question is, what can we do about this? I would love to have both of you answer this question. So just for a bit of change, Lindsey, what are the things we can learn from this? What are the things people can do, normal people can do to adapt and manage this problem?
Well, I'm going to kind of step back a little bit, and I wanted to reflect a little bit more about what Peter said about the complex relationship between science and society, and kind of what we're all doing here tonight. So I like to think that we work across this continuum from facts to understanding to empathy to action. And we scientists like Peter and Josh and myself, we're charged with creating facts and generating knowledge from facts. But it is so important to communicate that knowledge to the public, like we're doing right now, to create the empathy that is to create the caring about the issue that's going to generate the action. So I want to use as an example, right? Think back to what happened with DDT and pesticides, right? Scientists created facts and knowledge about these chemicals and their impacts on plants and animals, particularly charismatic animals like eagles and ospreys. But then it was Rachel Carson, right? Who wrote Silent Spring, which inspired the public to care, which generated action in the form of a ban on these pesticides. And so similarly for acid rain that we've talked about. So we scientists, including Peter and myself at Hubbard Brook, we create facts and knowledge about acid rain and its impacts on forests and fish and tombstones. If you guys remember back, we shared that knowledge with the public who cared enough to generate action in the form of the Clean Air Act amendments of 1990. I think we're in the process of doing the same thing with climate change. So we scientists at places around the world like Hubbard Brook, like those LTERs that Peter was talking about, are creating facts and knowledge, which we are indeed sharing with the public, again, like right here. And I believe that will eventually lead to enough global caring to generate action and policy shifts around climate change. I've seen it happen before with DDT, with lead in gas, with acid rain. So I remain an optimist that we need to continue creating the knowledge, sharing it, and leading to good action. So towards that end, I think it's critical to support the science. And I am biased, but I think it's especially important to maintain research sites such as Hubbard Brook, where we can conduct these long-term research and experiments, such as the ones we've talked about today. And so I hope everybody out there finds it comforting that there are places like Hubbard Brook, that they exist. I sometimes think of us like a sleeping giant out there in the forest, slowly, carefully looking out for the health and sustainability of the forest that many of us depend on and we really care deeply about. We scientists are every day developing the facts and understanding that can provide that best available science to inspire people like all of you out there to care and to smartly enact change. So I hope all the Zoomers out there will listen to and help support the kind of science that we've been talking about, not only for all of us today, but also for generations that will come after us. And I have a new grandchild, so I can say that with a lot of emotion. So I think it's just in sum, this complex, creating the facts, the knowledge, sharing it as we're doing and leading to changes in policy.
Great, thank you, Lindsey. Peter, do you have a couple words to add briefly, and then we'll close the formal informal discussion, and we'll grab a few questions.
Yeah, I would just kind of support what Lindsey said. That I think our examples really support the need that we're facing complex problems. Climate change is an overarching problem, but we've got a track record. Especially with long-term research, where our ability to identify problems and propose solutions. I think it's a good investment if people put their faith and trust in science. And so I look forward to figuring out a lot of how our ecosystems are changing in response to climate change. How can we adapt? How can we mitigate?
Great. Thanks. And, as somebody who raises money for science for a living, let me say it's a hard lift, right? There are many things you can do. You can donate to Cary Institute, and of course, I'll be grateful for that. Hubbard Brook is unusual as a long-term ecological research site because they have their own foundation, the Hubbard Brook Research Foundation, and they do remarkable work on both raising money to support Hubbard Brook, but even more importantly, they oversee the housing at Mirror Lake where scientists stay. They do tremendous communication work. And I would like to, at least on this one, incur the wrath of my staff and say you could also just make a donation to the Hubbard Brook Research Foundation. Hubbard Brook, as Lindsey said, really is one of the most important and one of the most famous forest ecosystems in the world. And if you're an ecologist, and particularly for a forest ecologist, the words Hubbard Brook means something to you and to your students and to everyone you work with. So let me jump in. Oh, the other thing you can do, of course, Lindsey, as an employee of the federal government, couldn't say this, but you can tell your congressmen, your senators to support the National Science Foundation, to support the Forest Service research. Research in federal budgets is often what is cut first because it's sort of invisible. Right? If the roads aren't maintained in national parks, if Forest Service doesn't have money to fight fires, people notice. But if they don't have research money, it takes a while for them to notice. So do let your representatives know how important research is and how much you care about research. So after having made plugs for funding in 3 different ways, let me throw a couple questions at our panelists. You know, there are a couple questions that I'm going to give Lindsey first, which go to the idea of species-specific sensitivity and whether some species break earlier and later. Is there a sequence? And David Haskell, who knows a bit about trees, asked, you know, whether you see increase in abundance or frequency of different trees and shrubs as a result of these storms. So just generally, what are the species-specific responses, and are there differences, or is it just a big cudgel that hits the forest pretty equally?
No, I think there's a lot of differences, and some of the best work is the work by Kevin Smith and Wally Shortall. They set up some plots after the 1998 experiment. It was a natural experiment. After the 1998 storm, they followed trees over time. And so they were able to say things like, you know, well, you know, the younger stands seem to be more resilient than the older stands. And then in the older stands, the damage appeared to be greater for American beech, followed by yellow birch, followed by sugar maple. In general, we see that the hardwoods seem a little more susceptible to damage than the softwoods. You know, on our sites, it was interesting, the spruce trees, right? You think of your Christmas tree, right? And they would have the snow load and their branches would go like this and they go, whoop, and they'd be like closing an umbrella. And when the ice melted off, they just go up like this, where their hardwood trees had lost their branches. So we do see differences in species. You've probably heard about beech, particularly younger beech. You know, that's the kind of classic thing you see by the side of the highway. Those younger beech, they don't snap, but they bend over, right? And then the tops get stuck in the ice and they stay bent over, you know, for years after it. And we saw this at Hubbard Brook. So that those lower beech were all bent over and actually created this big kind of donut hole in the canopy. So we can definitely talk about different species. If you're a plant physiologist, you can talk about the tensile strength of the wood, you know, so you can predict, you know, which are going to break. But we will be looking for that in our plots as we go on through time.
Right.
So that was kind of a long-winded answer, but
that's fine. And thank you for the performance art. It was great. You know, if this career, you know, stalls, you have a real opportunity to act.
I was just stretching.
Yeah. Okay. Peter, I want you to follow up on this one. You know, clearly with differential mortality, we're looking at changes in the species composition and frequency and structure of the forest. But more generally, what's going to happen as the climate continues to warm? No matter, I mean, look, we've got a new commitment on January 20th towards climate change at a federal level, which I think is hugely important. We're going to be rejoining Paris. We're going to be doing all sorts of interesting things. But you know what? We're past a tipping point and climate is shifting. So what is the increasingly warm and wetter climate in the Northeast going to mean in the future, Peter, for this kind of snow and ice storm?
Yeah, so certainly there's what we certainly have been seeing in the Northeast is that it is warmer and it is wetter. Precipitation has gone up by about 15 to 20%, you know, since 1900. And one of the early predictions that people made 50 years ago or so was if it gets warmer and wetter, our forests are going to grow better. And in most cases, that's what we see. You know, it's warmer and wetter. The trees grow faster, they grow bigger, except where they don't, right? So there's an interaction between the basic controllers, you know, rain, the sun shines, the rain falls, the trees grow. But if there are these diseases like the hemlock woolly adelgid coming in, the hemlocks are not growing better, even though it's warmer and wetter. If the change in winter conditions is killing roots of sugar maple, so then the sugar maple aren't going to go better. And the question of what the vegetation is going to look like in 50 years or so is really a really difficult question that we can address with long-term research. Right. And again, you have a long-term research site, and you get a bunch of surprises, right? So you make a bunch of predictions that if it's warmer and wetter, certain species should should do well and other species should do less well, and certain species should replace others. But we have found that the trees in the field just do not read the scientific literature, and they don't read the scientific textbooks either. And so we're constantly getting surprising results from our long-term observations. So we combine those with experiments and continued long-term observations, and we're building up an understanding of these complex changes. But it's a really hard question because it's a complex change. I think we can sort it out with long-term, this kind of mixture of long-term observations and experiments and comparative studies.
Right. And, there are a couple of questions about carbon sequestration, and can I intuit from what both of you have said, we don't really know, because on the one hand, branches break, carbon gets released, blah, blah, blah. On the other hand, there may be increased growth and faster growth if it gets warmer and wetter, but maybe not. Do we have any sense of how carbon sequestration, and then the next question is, more specific, so I'll wait on that, how carbon sequestration will change with increased ice, decreased snow, and or increased, dumping of snow and then no snow at all?
Well, the great challenge with carbon sequestration is it's a balance. So if the trees go more, they pull more carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. But if it's warmer and wetter, the trees grow more. But the other side of the coin is decomposition. And so if it's warmer and wetter, you get more decomposition. So that balance. The forests in the northeastern part of the U.S. are a great carbon sink, and they're regrowing forests. They're not that old. They're sequestering carbon in the biomass, or sequestering biomass carbon in the soil. And so they're a pretty good carbon sink. I would point out, and this is outside my area of expertise, it's just a personal opinion, but if you decarbonize the economy, you'll sequester a lot of carbon.
Yeah.
And so we can worry about forests, and we can rely on forests for carbon sequestration, but you could argue that we have a fossil fuel problem, and maybe we should stop burning fossil fuels.
Right. Lindsey, I was wondering, somebody asked about mycorrhizal fungus. Somebody else asked about amphibians that overwinter in the soils. Jump in, either of you. But the loss of snow cover, the increased cold of the soils, does that have an impact on things small and large? In this case, amphibians are large, that use the soils as a place to live and or overwinter?
There is some nice discussion of this in this confronting changing winters, and certainly as we lose some of the, as just plug for that, as we lose some of the snow, we lose some of that habitat for those little critters that are starting to run under the snowpack in the winter. So that can have some demonstrated negative effect. There's negative effects on salamanders that we've seen, and of course we always think of this almost kind of crazy asynchrony for snowshoe hares,
right.
That they're white in the winter, but then if they stay white too long, so definitely a lot of impacts on the critters. We didn't do a whole lot of work on that on the ice storm experiment. We did a little bit of birds work, and one of the things that we showed that after the ice storm, the birds, we didn't have different birds come in, but they used the areas that have been iced in very different ways. So we saw very interesting behavioral changes. So Peter, you might have some more to jump in on that.
All I know is that salamanders are kind of the charismatic megafauna of the soil ecosystem, and our founding director Gene Likens started collecting data on salamanders in the 60s, and there are still people collecting data on salamanders at Hubbard Brook that come from as far away as Montana to do that work. And yes, indeed, anything you change in the winter is going to have a big, anything you change in the soil in the winter is going to have an effect on those. I guess the other research topic we've had at Hubbard Brook is moose. And Lynn Christensen got her PhD. She's a professor at Vassar College, just down the road now. And moose have a big effect on the vegetation because they browse the vegetation. And if there's more snow, then that kind of protects the vegetation from the moose browsing. And yet, of course, we're interested in moose as a charismatic component of the forest. And so it's another good example of the complexity of the system, all of which is changing as you change the climate.
Well, so it's 8:04, which we're a little over. Can I just say, in the last 3 minutes, we've done moose, we've done salamanders, we've done ice, we've done snow, and we've also emphasized, thank you, Lindsay and Peter, the importance of these long-term research programs. In a normal, and I use that in quotes because there is no such a thing anymore, in a world without massive carbon release and other greenhouse gases, in which we were not sequentially warming the climate in a way to create the most frightening natural experiment I can think of. So 40 years ago, we might have been able to say things with greater certainty. And maybe one could argue that after 50 years, we would have known more than we do now about the range of responses that we're seeing at Hubbard Brook. But Peter, Lindsay, may you continue this for many years to come. And I think what's wonderful about Hubbard Brook is when you go to those cooperator meetings, you have people like Gene Likens who helped found the studies decades ago, and you've got undergraduates and grad students and postdocs, and there is a wonderful age structure to Hubbard Brook, not just of the trees, but of the people. And so with that, I want to thank Heather Kroner Real Estate and Harney and Sons Teas, both local community businesses in the Middlebrook areas. Harney and Sons you may know about because they are now global. I always joke with Mike Harney that you've got a great tea company when you sell your tea that is an American brand in the royal house, the royal properties of the United Kingdom. That's really quite remarkable. Harney's and Heather Kroner's Real Estate have sponsored these talks, which is why we can bring them to everyone for free. But also thank you to our staff who make doing this look easy. Lori Quillen and Leslie Timbalti particularly are really great at making these happen. And thank you to the 338 of you who've hung on. We peaked at over 450, which is a new record. Let's try and break that in January for Sarah Batterman, where Sarah and I will be talking about forests again, but in this case, tropical forests and how we can help tropical forests not just recover, but sequester more carbon. So that's the teaser. Again, thank you. We'll send out an email following this. And when you get it, please forward it to your friends and family. The recordings are really good and they're worth watching. I hope you agree. So have a good night and we look forward to seeing you in January. Happy holidays, stay safe, stay small, and don't travel. This will be over, but not soon. Take care, bye.